That's us.
Oh, okay. So I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Richard Watson. Richard shall be talking this evening about the father of speleology, Edouard-Alfred Martel, and how he played a significant role in shaping the science of speleology and pioneered many aspects of early modern cave exploration, including the first recorded scientific exploration of the Marble Arch cave system in 1895. Before you begin, Richard, I would just like to thank you personally for joining us this evening. Richard has played an important role in the early developments of the Marble Arch Caves show cave. He was the manager of the Marble Arch Caves for 33 years before his retirement in 2018. We're really delighted to have you with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing this talk. So I'm just going to hand over to Richard now. Okay, I'll just share the presentation for you now, Richard.
Thank you, Michelle.
No problem.
And you can't see the presentation. There we go. I've still got my mug look. Two mugs together here. Right, so thank you, Michelle. Okay, folks, so the talk tonight is entitled, Are We Not Dreaming? And the reason for that, I hope, will become clear later on. As Michelle said, I'm talking about Edouard-Alfred Martel. Most of the time I just refer to him as Edouard Martel or Martel, who many people call the father of speleology. Okay, now Martel is a bit of a hero of mine for reasons I hope that become clear in the talk. He did lead an extraordinarily adventurous life. Even by today's standards, his achievements are hugely impressive, really, and all the more so, though, considering that he lived in and did most of his explorations in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, when, of course, transportation was much more difficult than it is today. Telecommunications didn't really exist, apart from telephone and telegraph, perhaps, and of course, the whole concept of traveling around the globe for leisure purposes was pretty alien. So you'll see that he was well ahead of his time in many respects. Now, for technical reasons, I'm going to have to ask Michelle to change each slide, so because I don't have control of the screen. So if you can go on to the next one, Michelle, please. Okay, this is just a little synopsis of Edouard-Alfred Martel. Born in 1859, died in 1938 at the age of 79. And as you can see, he was many things: a lawyer, a speleologist, a mountaineer, naturalist, scientist, antiquarian, businessman. Sometimes those things don't go together, but he was quite a successful businessman, and of course an author. And as you can see, he was active in cave exploration from 1888 to 1914, which is a good long spell. But more importantly, he visited over 1,500 caves, and very few cavers even today would have reached anything like that. But in his case, in many instances, he was the first person to either enter them or to properly document them. And he traveled to explore caves in very many countries. Some European countries, which you might expect for a Frenchman, I suppose, but also further afield, Russia, United States, England, and as we'll hear, Ireland. And if that wasn't enough, he was quite a prolific author, published 20 books, 780 articles. He took time to be the editor of La Nature, which was a prestigious environmental type magazine of the day. And he gave many lectures and talks, and took the time also to be a member of a lot of prestigious organizations such as the Touring Club of France. So all will be revealed hopefully as we go along. Next, please, Michelle. Okay, he was born in Pointat, if my French pronunciation is right, which is it's nowadays it's essentially a northern suburb of Paris. About 20 odd kilometers from the center of Paris. And in this house on the right, I can't show you things with the cursor, so that the doorway there, you can see that's the house he was born in. So next slide, please, Michelle. I actually have a little toolbar across the middle of my screen. I'm just wondering if I can get rid of it, because it's impinging on some of the stuff. No, I don't think I can. Anyway, just have to persevere. Okay, so like many children, he was a keen reader of books. Of course, there's no TV or video games or anything in those days, so reading was very much an occupation for children, certainly middle-class children. And one of his favorite authors was Jules Verne, sorry, and in particular, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and that probably helped. Martel would give that credit for sparking his interest in the underground world. And he studied at the Lycée Concorde, say in Paris. He was particularly keen in geography and the natural scientists, and he went on to win the first prize for an open competition in geography in 1877. So even at an early age, all this was starting to build up in him. He spent holidays in some of the mountain areas of Europe, in the Alps, and in 1879 he visited Postojna Cave in Slovenia, which even then was a tourist cave. Quite an impressive place. Next, please. Next slide, yeah. Okay, but this is the year of karst and caves, as Michelle said. So the karst region, for those of you don't know, is essentially where limestone rock is exposed on the surface and where it has been weathered by countless ages of wind, rain, frost, and of course the solutional impact of water falling from the sky or flowing across the limestone, which slowly but surely dissolves minute quantities of it away. And so the upper photograph is a typical mountainous karst area, and the lower photograph shows how limestone can be fretted and worn away, even on the surface, into strange and unusual and impressive shapes like this archway. So this is in Causse de Savant in southern France, and he wasn't a caver at this time, but he was beginning to get interested in these type of areas, these karst areas, and of course it's quite a natural progression from exploring the surface of karst areas to explore the caves, which many of them are riddled with. Next slide, please. Okay, I can't read the text on this myself now, so my memory jogger has gone a bit, but because this toolbar is over it, so I'll let you read that yourself. But basically it says that he joined the bar as a lawyer in Paris in 1886, and he used his salary to augment his passion for exploring the outdoors. So that's a photograph of him around that time, and the letter on the right is him writing from his legal offices to a client. So quite well to do. As I say, probably, I don't particularly like the class structure, but he was certainly sort of upper middle class sort of guy, and from quite a well-to-do family, and he used his money to good advantage, let's say. Next slide, please. And of course, this, as I said earlier, this was the 19th century when travel as we know it today just wasn't even dreamed of. There would have been railways, canals, but a lot of transport still relied on the horse. And for travel across rural France, people were using essentially stagecoaches to move around. So this is typical here. You can see the name of the hotel, actually, the Grand Hotel for Voyagers. And this one's down in southern France. And this is actually a photograph associated with Martel. It was taken on one of his trips. The second man standing, not the one holding the horse, the second man with the hat and the moustache, is a guy called Louis Armand, and he was essentially Martel's right-hand man in cave exploration. He was really the general fix-it man and the guy that organised the expeditions and the camps, and recruited local labour to help with a lot of the work. So we'll hear a lot more about him. This was also the era where, as I say, where gentlemen adventurers were exploring. And the right-hand photograph is from a copy of the Illustrated London News, which was quite a popular gentleman's magazine of that period. And I put that in just to show these are English adventurers, I suppose, in this case, but they're in the Tyrol in Austria, and they're mountaineering high up in the Tyrol with a local guide. And it just gives you some idea of the exploration techniques that mountaineers of the time were using. The rope together there. If they came to a narrow chasm they couldn't get across, they just cut down a tree and throw it across and clamber across the trunk using ladders and stuff. And Martel was used to this, and he would have brought some of these techniques underground with him. Okay, next slide, please. So continuing his interest in karst, one of the first places where Martel really started to explore caves was in the Savant. This is in the Gorge de Tarn. And you can see quite a picturesque, beautiful place. This river, the Tarn River runs through, but you can see there's small cave entrances along the waterline there. And if you look here and there on the rock face, you'll see some hollows and holes and dimples in it as well. And quite a popular area today for outdoor pursuits for French people and tourists. But of course, in Martel's day, this was virtually unknown. And very few people would have ventured there. So he was one of the first people to go to it and start opening it up. And the people on the right there are obviously exploring part of the gorge on using the via ferrata or wire rope. So quite an adventurous pursuit. They're obviously clipping into the rope as they go along with you. And if you haven't done it, it is used in cave techniques as well to some extent, not with wire ropes, but the harness and the safety lines and all that sort of stuff are probably derived more from caving than mountaineering. So you essentially have two little rope tethers. You always have to have at least one attached to the wire. So you push one, the carabiner on the end of the tether along the wire until you get to the end. Take your spare one and clip onto the next part of the wire beyond the next bolt and carry on. So again, this it's quite a well-used caving technique and something that Martel would have pioneered. Okay, next slide, please. And this is a similar place, perhaps more impressive. This is certainly a much deeper gorge. This is the Gorge de Verdun. It's in Haute-Provence in the Maritime Alps in southern France, about 80 or 90 kilometers north of Nice. It's actually, the Haute-Provence is actually also a UNESCO Global Geopark, the Haute-Provence UNESCO Global Geopark. I've stood at the top of it, but I didn't have the time. I was there on Geopark's business, so I did stand at the top and look down, but it is imposingly deep, but unfortunately we didn't have time to do any exploration. But Martel and his companions are reputed to be the first people to descend to the bottom and follow the river along its course in the gorge. And so the river runs for quite a few kilometers, and as you can see, can be quite a lot of white water in it. Some high vertical drops, so not an easy thing to undertake. It's been touristified a little bit since, but not overwhelmingly so. And you can see the girl in the upper right photograph, she's coming up using one of these fixed via ferrata things as well. That's more a bar than a wire, but the principle's the same. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so probably the first major cave exploration Martel did was this place. It's the Abîme de Bramabau in the Savant. Abîme just means abyss, so the abyss of Bramabau. Middle photograph gives a distant view of it. You can see it's just essentially a gash in the limestone. You can see the bedding of the limestone running around in this gorge and the river winding round. It's like a miniature Grand Canyon, really. I suppose the river has cut down through the limestone, exposing the strata and winding its way around, forming pillars and isolated stacks and stuff like that. So it's quite a interesting and formidable place. And the river comes gushing out of this gash. So obviously people knew that the water was coming out from underground, but nobody had really ventured into it. Maybe a few people had gone within the limited daylight, but Martel decided he would have a look. And the left-hand picture is an illustration from one of Martel's books. Shows the guys with their ladder and lifting a boat up because the water inside soon gets too deep to wade in, and you need a boat to, certainly in those days you would have needed a boat to progress through the cave. Nowadays it's a tourist cave, and you can see the tourists in the right hand photograph walking in through, so they're going along where presumably somebody's hollowed out a bit of the limestone to form that passageway for them. Okay, next slide please. So I hope you're beginning to get a sort of an idea of the adventurous nature that Martel had. As I say, really up to Martel's time, the number of people who had seriously explored caves even across Europe was quite limited. There were a few guys in Austria and some Swiss guys probably, but very few people, and they were all working in isolation, and they were having to evolve techniques as they went on. And Martel was certainly the most prolific of those early cave explorers, and I hope you're beginning to get a sense of just how daring and adventurous this man was. Okay, so this is him at a very famous French cave called the Gopher de Padraig, and the main photograph shows Martel making the first descent. So he's basically got his rope ladder strung over the side of the massive pothole that forms the entrance to the cave, and he's starting to climb down it. He's got a lifeline on, which has been paid out by the line of guys standing in the background. These wouldn't have been fellow cavers by any means, or people even who had experience of necessarily working with them, because normally what he did, there was only him and one or two other people that companions would have gone to an area, and they would have recruited local men to help. And just for insurance, I suppose there he's got the village priest or the father in his long cassock watching on, so that might have given some help or not. So we'll hear a little bit more about Padraig as we go along. The lower drawing shows Martel and his companion exploring. The only two of them went down the cave. They brought a collapsible canvas boat with them and went off and found several kilometers of unknown cave, huge cave with an underground river in it. And the side sketch, it's a cross section of the cave, basically showing the end portion of the cave, which Martel called the Grand Dome. And you can see it goes soaring away up, doesn't quite reach the surface, but in years to come it will probably break through. Okay, next slide please. Okay, we're still at Padraig. This is left-hand picture is the entrance shaft that Martel was shown on the previous slide, descending. This is it in modern times. There's an elevator goes down. You can see the scaffolding there for the elevator, and then the walkway goes down into the cave. And interestingly, they have a roof over the walkway because pebbles and small stones will fall in, and given the height that they have to fall, if one landed on your head, it wouldn't do you much good. The tour there is still pretty faithful to Martel's time. Most of it's done by boat along the same river as Martel would have first discovered. And you can see it's a very well decorated cave, the right hand photograph. Massive speleothems or speleothems are just the calcite deposits left by the water and moving through the cave. So stalactites, flow stones, stalagmites, all these things are speleothems, but massive flow stone there is very picturesque. Okay, if I remember right, the next slide gives us a little film clip, silent movie of a reenactment of part of Martel's journey. So we'll just let you watch that. Okay, Michelle, next slide, please. So, bear in mind, as I said, these two guys were first people ever to enter this cave. They had no idea what they were going to find, and what challenges and obstacles they might meet. And off they went on this little flimsy canvas boat with some candles for light and no hope of anybody coming in after them if anything had happened to them. So, hugely adventurous. Another adventure he had was he married in 1890 to Aline de Launay. She was a fair adventurous as well, if all by all accounts. The right-hand photograph shows her and Martel climbing at quite some height in the Alps, and he's pretty well dressed for the occasion. But ladies of the day who went off adventuring just basically wore their ordinary street clothes. So she's got her long dress, tight bodice, even her hat with feathers or flowers in it. So whether some of you would like to walk up to the Quilca boardwalk dressed like that, I'm not sure. Okay, next slide, please. By this time, Martel had given up practicing law because he'd started publishing, he'd started giving lectures, as it said, writing up his adventures. And it got to the stage where he was basically making a full-time living from his passions, from his pursuits. He was still editing La Nature, you can see it on the right-hand side, but he was also giving lectures, as I say. So this one is a lecture, for instance, the advertising leaflet there at the Academy of Scientists in 1885. He gave a lecture on human paleontology from caves, human debris and pottery from Lausière. And you can see that he was helped by a guy called Louis de Launay, which of course was his brother-in-law. Okay. And they collaborated on a lot of publications and articles, and then both of them were editors in turn of the magazine, and they explored quite a number of caves. And again, I can't read my own script because the toolbar's over it, so I'll let you read the rest of it.
Richard, sorry to interrupt you there. And someone, Peter in the chat has actually recommended a way of getting rid of that.
Oh, right. What's that?
Right, sorry for interrupting you there. He's recommended closing off any of the side panels you can see.
Yes, but don't forget I'm looking at Michelle's screen here, not my own.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I can take it off.
Participants.
Close the chat channel. This one.
Yeah.
No, that's just reduced the size of the screen, really. I'll persevere with it, I think. I'll persevere with it, see how we get on. Oops. I've gone off full screen now. Right. I think I'll leave well alone. It might disappear altogether on me. Right. Okay. So next slide, please, Michelle. So as well as caving and visiting karst areas, Martel decided at some stage that he was going to be an alpine winter mountaineer, which for anybody who's tried it is, I haven't tried it, but I've done a bit of winter climbing in the Scottish Highlands. So anybody who's tried it would know that this is not something to take lightly. And certainly at the heights Martel was getting up to, it was quite a serious undertaking, especially for the time. So off he went to climb in the Alps, but in particular he was doing that because he was interested in glaciation, and of course this was around the time, surprisingly late in the day, I suppose, in scientific terms, when people first started to understand glaciation and the whole concept of ice ages and landscape being shaped by ice and glaciers which had disappeared from many parts of Europe. So a lot of fresh and new scientific thinking being thought out. So Martel, as I say, he found the time to go off and become quite a serious winter alpinist and a glaciologist. And of course, many parts of the Alps have limestone geology, so they have caves, and some of the caves can be very beautifully decorated with ice formations. So he took time to explore quite a few of those too. Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned Louis Armand before. This is him again, the top picture. Fairly hardy looking guy. He wasn't particularly an academic. He was more of a very capable man with his hands. He could turn his hand to making virtually anything. He could organize a lot of the rope work, and as I say, he could bring together a gang of inexperienced local labourers and get them to perform quite challenging things like providing a lifeline for a caver descending 300 feet underground. So formidable enough guy in his own right. Martel gave him a lot of credit for aiding the explorations, and in particular, there's a very famous cave. It's called the Even Armand in France. It's part of it is a very I haven't been to this place unfortunately, but it's a very impressive cave. You can see the people here where Michelle's pointing them out with the cursor and the formations. It looks absolutely stunning. But they were exploring this chasm, or this pothole you can see in the bottom left-hand picture. And they got down, and it didn't seem to be much at the bottom. And getting a bit late in the day, and Martel wanted to pack in and just go home. I think he just wanted to go back to the pub and have a few pints. And Louis said, no, he says, I have a feeling about this place. There's something down here. So we'll go on. So they went on for another hour or so, and then they found stuff like this here, all these massive stalagmites there. It's just unbelievable, really. And as I say, Martel gave Louis deservedly full credit for that. And the cave was named, Martel named the cave in Louis' name. So fair play. Okay, next slide, please. And if you remember, we talked about the gentlemen explorers earlier on, and some of the rudimentary climbing techniques that were being used at the time. Martel had brought some of those underground, but he soon found that he had to adapt new techniques to get through the challenging caves that he was finding. And of course, one of the biggest challenges for anybody going underground is reliable source of light. And we saw in the film clip in the reenactment that they were basically just using candles in the gopher de Padraig. But that wasn't good enough for really difficult caves, especially when you're having to clamber about and climb up quite difficult and dangerous areas of rock. So they experimented with different techniques. Sometimes I just found the easiest thing to do was to carry a flaming torch in your hand, but of course that's liable to go out in a strong draft or if it gets wet. And he started looking elsewhere, and one of the things that he started using were carbide lights, which is where basically water, you can see the carbide light on the right hand side here. This is one I have in my own collection, and it's essentially a miner's light. It's got a handle on the top for carrying it, but it's divided into two chambers. The upper chamber contains water, and the bottom chamber contains calcium carbide. And by using the little thing in the middle underneath the handle, you can regulate the flow of water, so you get a steady drip, falls from the top into the bottom, and the water reacts with the carbide to produce a settling gas, which comes out the spout. The spout is filled in apart from a tiny little pinhole, so this little jet of gas comes out, and you light that, and it gives quite a bright, clear flame. And you can get modern versions for caving, and some people prefer them to electric light because they give a good all-round glow of light rather than a directional point. And so a good light, but again, will go out if some water falls on it or if there's a strong enough draft. The middle photograph shows a carbide light that Martel was using in a cave in 1892, and he dropped it and it was swept away in the streamway in the water where they were wading, and it was found many years later by some lucky caver. So I wish it hadn't been me, but however, it wasn't. So there we go. Okay, next slide, please. How are we doing for time? Are you all right? So as well as developing caving techniques and developing new equipment and different things, Martel was very seriously pursuing the science of caves, which is called speleology. It's a Latin term. It basically means underground. And many aspects to cave science which people might not always think about. Geology is obviously one that probably comes to mind. Paleontology, where you're looking at remains of creatures and life down there, but also studying flora and fauna, modern current life. Meteorology, the weather in caves. If a cave's big enough, they can have their own weather systems. It's surprisingly true, but there you are. It's not unusual if you're in a cave, the passage is high enough to see a mist or a cloud in the top. The effects of pollution, that was something that Martel was particularly interested in, because a lot of the public water supply especially in the southern parts of France, in the big limestone regions, a lot of the public water supply was coming from underground springs, and there were a number of examples of village communities being made very ill by bad water coming out of these springs. And that was particularly the case at a French army garrison, where a number of the soldiers fell ill and died of typhoid, and the French government brought Martel in to try and work out what was happening. So he realized that the water coming out of the cave had to come from somewhere, so he set out to find all the various points where the water was sinking underground to form the underground river that flowed out of this cave at the army garrison. And one of them, he found that farmers were using a big pothole to throw down dead livestock, so they were unwittingly poisoning the water supply that the soldiers were drinking 10 kilometers further down the valley. So and armed with that information and working with other scientists, Martel and worked with the French government to introduce some quite strict public water supply safety measures, which, given the times, was very much ahead of its day, and but very necessary, really. He also experimented with cave photography. Bear in mind, you're using big plate cameras, big glass plate cameras. The colored picture is early slide projector, magic lantern, which again would have used carbide to create the light to project the image onto a wall. And the lower photograph shows a device that Martel got somebody to make for him, and it's essentially a camera light. So what it is, on the left hand side there's a reflector, this sort of round shape. The middle part, it has a clockwork mechanism in it, and the reel on the right is full of magnesium strip. And if you think back to your science days at school, in secondary school, when the science teacher would give you a little bit of magnesium strip and you would light it, it would flare up in a bright flame. And essentially this thing did the same, but it kept pushing more and more of the strip out of in the middle of the reflector as it burnt down. So you got this big, bright, steady light. Bit cumbersome, but pretty effective, I think. Apart from the fact that it produced smoke, and before long the cave passage would start to fill up with smoke. But there you are, you have to use what you've got. Next slide, please. Now, don't think that Martel was a man to endure hardship if he didn't have to. Some of his expeditions were quite large-scale affairs. This shows him at a campsite where they set up, and again he's got local helpers, local farmers bringing along their horses to help them load up the gear. So you can see the two horses, one on the right is loaded up with ropes and ladders, the one on the left similarly, but it's also got one of the collapsible boats attached to it. Nice tents in the background, and Martel is standing there in his nightshirt. So this is how he would have went to bed. So his nightcap on and his nightshirt, and so all the comforts of home, really. Next slide, please. And this slide again shows some of the boats that Martel would have had in use. And the guys, I'm not sure whether they're lowering the boat in the left photograph or raising it up to try and get further up the stream to see what goes on beyond, but you can get the idea. Bit precarious, so all balancing on knobs of rock and trying to hold lights up at the same time, and having to rely on one of your companions to give you a helping hand. The right hand photograph, from what I gather, they've used the boats here to go along an underground river, and they're beached the boats, and they're climbing up to a higher level to see where the unknown cave passages that lie before them go to. Next slide, please. Just a slight diversion to talk about some of the boats themselves. He didn't have the boats made. Again, we're in the age of Victorian gentlemen explorers, so there were all sorts of weird and wonderful things available for the gentleman explorer that you could buy in very posh, expensive shops in the main shopping streets in places like London or New York or Paris. So you could buy all sorts of things, some useful and some totally useless, but there we go. And collapsible boats happen to be one of the things that were quite popular. So some of the boats are used, we know, were made by this Osgood company, the ones on the left there, from Michigan in USA. And other ones were made by the Berthon Boat Company in Limster, I think is how you pronounce the name of the town in Hampshire. The Osgood company seems to have disappeared into oblivion, but the Berthon Boat Company still operates, but they're more into high-speed launches like this RNLA boat here nowadays. And the upper right photograph shows a selection of boats they used, that they produced, Martel would have been going for one of the smaller ones. Probably the most famous collapsible canvas boats are two of the lifeboats on the Titanic. The Titanic carried two collapsible canvas lifeboats, and they floated off the Titanic as it sank, but unfortunately they were upside down, so some people did survive on them, but they had to sit on the keels, I think, until they were rescued. But so pretty sturdy boats, and you know, they would have stood up to quite a lot of abuse in the cave. So yeah, pretty stable as well. All right, next slide, please. I mentioned that Martel was a prolific publisher of books, so he produced a lot of scientific books or travel documentary type books. So subjects like the evolution of the underground here. Middle book is Les Abîmes, the Abysses, and of course to an Irish audience, a famous book of his was Irlande et Cavernes Anglaises, which he published in 1897 after a trip he made to Ireland and England in 1895. And that brings us on to Marble Arch, I think, soon. We're getting nearer home. So next slide, please. Okay. So if we think back to the second slide, I think it was, where I listed things that Martel was a lawyer, a scientist, an author, a businessman, but I also said that he was an antiquarian, which meant that he was very interested in historic buildings and similar places. So he decided to make an expedition to Ireland in 1895. He came on his own, no companions, and was about 4 or 5 weeks or something like that in Ireland, and it's amazing how much of Ireland he actually saw. And he didn't just hone in on caves. He sort of did he got a good round robin view of parts of Ireland. So we know he went to places like the Customs House and stood beside the River Liffey in Dublin, and he went to the Rock of Cashel down in County Tipperary. Again, a famous historical site, but of course also famous for, or interesting for Martel for its geology, because you can see it sitting on the rock there, and you can see the geology pretty plainly there. So quite a interesting and attractive place for somebody like Martel. Okay, next slide, please. And we know that he went to various caves, Mitchelstown Cave in County Tipperary, which is quite a good show cave in its own right now. Caves of Cong in County Mayo. And he went to Clare. We're not that sure that he explored caves in Clare, but because of course Clare has the famous Burren with its wonderful limestone geology and the Cliffs of Moher, but we certainly know that he went to the Cliffs of Moher and some other places. The Cliffs of Moher, if you haven't been to the Cliffs of Moher, you should really go. Quite a stunning place. Okay, next slide, please. He went to other parts of Ireland. I haven't got time to talk about them all, but he went to Donegal. He looked at rock formations and around Bundoran, like the Ferry Bridge. And he also went further up, went to Glencollinkill, looked at these very early forms of Irish crosses here. You can see the cross shape on the pillar-shaped stone. Went to the caves of Mahara, the lower middle photograph, and of course to Slieve League, which are reputedly the highest sea cliffs in Europe at about 2,000 feet. The black and white photographs of the dashing looking gentleman in the straw hat is me. And these were taken when we were doing a slide documentary about Martel back in 1995, the centenary of his explorations in Ireland. So we went out to a number of the places where we knew Martel had been and took some reenactment photographs. Okay, you can see the wind blowing quite savagely in the that photograph, because the tail of my natty jacket is nearly been ripped off, to be honest. Okay, next slide. He went to County Antrim, Dunluce Castle, which is obviously a very impressive place as well, standing on this big jutting area of rock out into the Atlantic, entered by just a narrow little pathway along the top, and has its own cave underneath as well, Mermaid's Cave, as you can see. And of course, you can't go there with that part of the world without going to the Giant's Causeway. And of course, there are other quite fascinating rock formations to be seen along the Causeway coast, like Cathedral Cave here. So many of you will be familiar with these places. But again, bear in mind, the Giant's Causeway is a pretty remote place for a lot of people visiting Ireland in those days, because you could go by rail, or or your other only alternative was really by some sort of horse-drawn transport. Okay, next slide, please. And that just brings me on to the next slide, which I've nearly forgotten about, because yes, so the railway shown here is actually the Clogher Valley Railway. That's in 5 Mile Town. I think this photograph was taken. So we know Martel travelled on it, probably when he was leaving Enniskillen rather than coming to it. He probably came to Enniskillen from Donegal, we think. So he would have come in from Bleak direction, probably Bundoran Junction, those sort of railway stations. And when he was leaving, we think he went back to via Belfast back over to England. So he definitely travelled on the Clogher Valley Railway. But other than that, he would have been relying on whatever animal transport he could get his hands on at the time. He stayed in Florence Court, but he explored quite a lot of different parts of Fermanagh, as we'll see. So he would have been relying on jointing cars like the top, but also to carry his gear, just ordinary farm carts, or even in some cases donkeys with creels. And it's interesting, for instance, when the Yorkshire Ramblers, a gentleman's exploring club from mainly based around Leeds and Bradford area, when they first visited Fermanagh in 1907, they stayed at Bow, where they explored caves there. They come over on a caving expedition. They explored caves in Bow, but when they wanted to go to Marlbank over at Florence Court, they were finding that they were having to spend 4 hours a day just travelling there and back. So, and then maybe doing an 8-hour stint in a cave. So, it's quite challenging. Not like jumping in your Ford Escort and tootling around the border roads like many cavers, English cavers, would have been doing in the 1960s and 70s. Next slide, please. So Martel was, as I say, he was a gentleman explorer. We think he was invited to Fermanagh by the Earl of Enniskillen. Certainly he stayed at Florence Court House. And the upper left photograph is Florence Court House, for those who don't know it. It's a National Trust property. The Earl of Enniskillen himself, he was the 4th Earl, and he was a very well noted collector of fossil fish, and he would have done grand tours to Europe, but instead of going to look at the big chateaus and museums and other places, he would have gone to quarries, and he talked to the foremen in the different quarries and said, if you find any good fossil fish in your geological deposits, I'll buy them sight unseen. And he built up a very formidable collection of fossil fish, which was later bought by the Natural History Museum in London, and still today forms a large part of their world famous collection of fossil fish. So just a little interesting snippet there for you. We know that he went with the Earl or some of the Earl's chums to some of the antiquarian sites in Fermanagh, like the main one they went to was Devonish Island, which for those who don't know Devonish Island, it's an island in Lough Erne, as it says, but it's got an early Christian site dating back to probably around the 12th century, monastic site, and it's got the best example of a round tower surviving in Ireland, which is in the middle of the picture there. And the round tower, of course, was a place of last resort refuge for the treasures of the monastery if raiders came, and some of the important monks and abbots would have disappeared up there too, but left everybody else on the ground. And we know Devonish was attacked twice by Viking raiders coming up the lake, so a fairly necessary bit of insurance to have on your site. Okay, and again, the photograph, this is in Lough Erne, it's a contemporary sort of photograph to 1895. You can see the gentleman pushing the boat out to go rowing off, and the lady in the back sitting there in her big long dress and hat and whole rigmarole, was the guys are in the short sleeves, quite relaxed looking. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're getting more into the nitty-gritty of his trip to Fermanagh. One of the places he was keen to get to was Bow, because he had some foreknowledge before he came to Ireland, so he planned his itinerary. So he knew that there was limestone up there, caves, and but also antiquarian sites. So most of these photographs are taken from our 1995 reenactment trip. Showed myself and my colleague Conor Burns. At the left-hand slide is Bow Church of Ireland, and by this time Martel had been joined in Fermanagh by a guy called Lister Jemison, who was a member of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, and Jemison's main interest was bats, so he teamed up with Martel to see if they could find any bats in Irish caves in Fermanagh. And the first place they found bats was actually in the tower of Bow Church of Ireland. There's a colony of bats there, and I'm pleased to say there's still a colony of bats in that tower today, so 100 years later, more than 100 years later. And then the other photograph shows the high cross at Bow Church of Ireland graveyard. The top part of the cross is missing, but the shaft of it's quite important because of the carving on it. And the picture in the middle photograph, which Michelle is obligingly showing, is actually Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So you can see Eve is on the right, and she's been fairly modest there with her covering herself up with her left hand, but in the middle is the serpent coiled round the tree, tempting them. So, of course, most people couldn't read in the days of early Christian days, so a lot of symbolism and important stories were portrayed in stone carvings, so that the priests could explain these to the parishioners. The reverse side of the cross, you can see the three wise men on there, for instance, towards the top of it. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So Martel wrote about these in his book, and but he was there to explore caves as well. So he went to Bow Caves. That's Conor and myself sitting outside Bow Caves entrance as it is today. It wouldn't have been like that in Martel's time. A lot of the cave has disappeared in the interim by quarrying operations in the 50s. They found caves or bats in there as well. Bow Cave sits under a fine house, which was the former RIC barracks, Royal Irish Constabulary Barracks at Bow. And we know that some of the police men there took visitors through the caves on request. So it's quite likely that a constable from the station might have taken Martel through Bow Caves. Nearby is Bow Caves are a very complex system of caves. Passages aren't very big, but they're very lengthy, but all confined within quite a small geographical area on the surface. It's essentially an interlocking maze of cave passages, so it's an incredibly easy place to get lost in. But nearby is a much bigger open cave, Polysumra Cave, or some people call it Cularkin Cave, which is after the local townland. Polysumra in Irish just basically means the hole at the base of the cliff. But you can see some photographs there of the entrance, and again, us doing our reenactment. And Martel did a survey of the cave and published a plan of it in his book, his 1897 book. Okay, next slide. And nearby, as you get up into what local people call the bars of Bow, this is the real, the higher upland areas of Bow. You're getting quite a depth of limestone, and you have quite deep caves. But this is one that Martel went to. It's called Arch Cave, or local people at the time would have, you can see the Irish name at the bottom of the photograph, Ug Borrigan. The photograph is actually from Martel's book, as are these two drawings. So even though he was there were only two of them, him and Jemison wasn't a caver. Jemison had probably never hardly been in caves before this. They did some quite intrepid exploration. But Martel was intrigued by this because there was a lot of water coming out of this cave, and there was a lot of limestone sitting on top of it. So he reckoned there must be something quite substantial between this exit where the water's flowing out on the surface. So next slide. So he talked to local people, and they told him about this pothole called Noon's Hole. So Noon's Hole sits basically in that little copse of trees there, and the photograph. This is right up in the bars of Bow, as far as you can go on the public road. And again, the right hand photograph is inside the entrance, just inside the entrance shaft, where the stream starts to plummet down into the cave. Cave got its name, Noon's Hole, from an incident in the mid-19th century when there was a rebel group active in Irish rebel group active in Fermanagh at that time, called the Ribbon Men. And it's a long story, so I'll try and cut it short. But a guy called Noon, Dominic Noon, came into the Bow area. He'd come from Roscommon, I think, and it was, and to a hiring fair in Donegal, and he was hired by a local farmer. And Dominic Noon apparently was a great dancer, and he knew a lot of dances which local people didn't know, so he was very much in demand for going around ceilidh houses to teach people new dance steps. And around that time, rightly or wrongly, Noon was suspected of informing on these Ribbon Men. So whether it was him or not, I don't know, but the Ribbon Men took him off over the mountaintop, intending to do him in, and as they were passing this pothole, which wasn't called Noon's Hole at that time, they decided they would throw him down it. So that's what happened. So that's how it's ended up being called Noon's Hole, after Dominic Noon. So bit of kangaroo court there. Whether he was guilty or not, nobody knows. Okay, next slide, please. We're getting near a Marble Arch now. We talked about Marble Arch a good while ago. So this is up on the Marl Bank, and Martel explored various places there. Monaster Gorge, this big open gash in the limestone up on Marl Bank. You can see somebody there standing looking at the cliffs which form the end of the gorge, and the river flows underneath to disappear into the cave at the bottom. Nearby are other caves. This is quite a well-known one for Irish cavers. This is Paul Nagollum. You can see the caver there dangling on the rope, having abseiled down from the top of the cliff and making his way down to the streamway. to go off and explore the cave passage beyond. So still plenty of adventurous caving to be had in Fermanagh. Next slide, please. And some of these places were in the estate or the demesne of the Earl of Enniskillen at Florence Court, including the Claddagh Glen, which many of you have walked in, which of course contains the river which flows out of Marble Arch Caves. So we know Martel went up through the Claddagh Glen. He would have picked up on the geology there. The top photograph shows two different types of limestone. The upper layer is very pure form of limestone. It's formed in quite thick, deep beds, and cave passages form relatively easily in it. The lower layer is a more impure form of limestone, much more thinly bedded, and cave development's much more difficult there. So essentially the caves on the most of the caves in the Marlbank form in the upper limestone, and same, that's what happens in the case of Marble Arch. And the river in Marble Arch, once it hits the lower limestone in the cave, essentially flows along the top of that before it bursts out in the surface at the Marble Arch Rising, which is the picture on the right. Okay. One of the biggest by volume cave risings in Britain or Ireland, in good flood flow, that rising puts out about 10 cubic meters of water per second, or 10 tons of water essentially per second, which is pretty substantial. Next slide, please. Okay, these are some, again, reenactment photographs, most of them showing parts of the cave that Martel explored. A lot of the names that are still used in the show cave were given to parts of the cave by Martel. So the Grand Gallery, for instance, the castle in Stalactite Chamber, these sort of things. The drawing on the bottom right shows is from Martel's book, and shows Martel and Jemison in one of his little canvas boats that he brought with him. He brought a whole load of kit with him in trunks and boxes and crates from France, and they're trying to get upstream in the Grand Gallery in Marble Arch, only to find that the roof comes down very low to the water, and they couldn't get on. But then we'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, next slide, please. This is a very famous illustration, an engraving from Martel's book. It shows the junction, which again Martel named in Marble Arch Caves, where the rivers which form the cave unite underground to form one river, and then flow outwards to come out at the rising. This essentially is the same place where the people on the show cave tour today get off the boat in the cave. And the photograph shows much the same place. Okay, but a very famous illustration in caving circles, and many people who never ever been to Ireland, many cavers would know this engraving here. I'm trying to illustrate it with my cursor. I keep forgetting that I'm not on my own screen. Next slide, please. Right, so getting near the end of Martel's expedition to Ireland. Well, he's left Ireland now. He's in England. On his way back to France, he stopped off in Yorkshire because he wanted to have a look at a place called Gaping Gill, which he'd heard about. Gaping Gill is North Yorkshire, and it's where quite an active mountain stream disappears down what's obviously a deep and intimidating pothole on the moor. Various local English gentlemen explorer types had tried to go down it. One had got a reasonable bit down, but not the whole way, but essentially nobody got to the bottom of it. So Martel decided he would have a go, and he turned up. By this time Jemison had left him, so he landed in Yorkshire. He presumably made some arrangements to meet up with some people there that he communicated with. and went up on the moor to this river sink and rigged up his kit and descended down into the pothole on his rope ladder and found that it was 321 feet deep, 98 meters, and he stepped down into the biggest cave chamber in Britain, which you could get Belfast City Hall in that chamber quite easily. Again, first man to do it, and if anything had happened to him down there, he would have been virtually marooned, because I doubt if anybody would have managed to get down to him. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see some more pictures. Oh, sorry, no. One of the results of that trip to Yorkshire was that Martel was invited to come back to Yorkshire by this gentleman's exploration club called the Yorkshire Ramblers. So he came back in 1904 and gave a talk to them at Leeds. And you can see on the cover of one of their journals here that the second one talks about speleology, a modern sporting science, and the talk is given by Edouard Martel. And this inspired these gentlemen to decide that, and he talked a lot about Marble Arch, caves and other places he'd seen in Ireland, but certainly about Fermanagh. He explained that in his explorations in Marble Arch, he knew that he had only managed to explore a small portion of the cave, and he said there are certainly large cave passages to be discovered in that cave. So some of these guys decided they would have an expedition to Fermanagh. So they came over in 1908. The photograph shows one of them, a guy called Major Wingfield, who was actually the Lord Lieutenant for Yorkshire. He doesn't necessarily look like a Lord Lieutenant there, but he was. And this is him descending Noon's Hole. Again, rope ladder, more or less everyday clothes, just rough everyday clothes, and a candle stuck in his hat for light. And they managed to get to the bottom, but they weren't able to explore the lengthy passages in Noon's Hole, and certainly never got anywhere near the exit at Arch Cave. But again, there's quite an interesting book which talks about some of these explorations that these guys done by a guy called Baker. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish off with a few more slides. So by this time, Martel was beginning to be quite famous. He was certainly well known in scientific circles and other branches of French society and in other countries as well. So here, for instance, this is his series of talks and lectures that he's giving about underground geography, or speleology. As you can see the names coming in here, speleology. And these were free courses that he was giving in association with the Sorbonne. If you look under the word speleology there, you can see towards the end the Place de la Sorbonne in the brackets. Yeah, that's it. And I haven't got time to start going through all the French lettering underneath, but if you get time to look at this again when it's on YouTube, you'll see a lot of different places mentioned and that he went to. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I say, he was becoming well known. He was invited to join a lot of distinguished societies. You remember I talked about the public health aspects of the water supply in parts of France. So he became a member of the Superior Council of Public Hygiene of France, for instance. He was elected as the president of the Geographical Society of France. He founded the Society of Speleology in 1895, and that's now known as the French, the Fédération Française de Speleology, a very prestigious group, some very accomplished cavers in its ranks and very well known. And then he was a recipient of the Legion of Honor, which is a very high, the highest civic award that can be given by the government of France. Next slide, please. So he died in 1938, as I said, age 79. This is his burial place in this cemetery of Montmartre in Paris, in this sepulchre. You've got a little plaque on the side. You can see it there, the father of speleology. People visited, put flowers on, French flags. So it's a well visited grave in Paris. So he's still well known. Next slide, please. He's still well known. He's named in all sorts of different places in France. There are streets named after him. There are public statues to him in town squares. A lot of French show caves have a bust of him or a statue. The photograph on the right is a figurine which represents Martel when he explored Marble Arch, which is on display in Marble Arch Cave Visitor Centre. And in the middle is a magazine that I happened to spot in an airport in Paris in 1999, and it has a cartoon, interestingly, of Martel and Jemison exploring a cave. So if it's Martel and Jemison, it must be Marble Arch. And he's basically saying, admire the fine execution of this artwork, Jemison. Neanderthal man was not always a brute after all. And of course, the cartoonist has followed on from that with the course into modern history. So I was delighted to find that, as you can imagine, sitting on a bookshelf in Orly Airport. And there we go. Next slide, please. I mentioned the streets and those names after him and statues, but also people recognize his academic prowess and the impact he had on public education and scientific knowledge. So there are a number of schools named after him. This is one here, a primary school. This is near the area of the Gorge de Tarn, if you remember that, and the Avon Armand, the cave that was named after Louis. And one of the latest places to be named after him is a student's residence hall in Pontoise, which, if we remember going back to one of the first slides, was Martel's birthplace. So there's the local university there has named a brand new hall of residence after him. Next slide, please. I'd like to think that Martel, if he came back to Fermanagh today or some of these other places, he'd be very pleased to see what's going on in terms of caves in Fermanagh. We have Marble Arch Caves, of course. We also have good outdoor education being carried out by places like God's Toll Outdoor Education Centre, who feature caves. This photograph on the bottom left shows a group of kids at Bow Caves. But I also think he would be impressed to see just how many people around the world have got into cave exploration and some of the discoveries that people have made in the meantime. And I think he would be very impressed to see this young lady in her orange caving suit leading the way in a cave, and it's a far cry from Martel's poor wife having to trundle around in her big long dress and straw hat. So times have moved on, girls. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. This is the illustration is from a guidebook to Padraig Cave, which of course Martel bought. And I think it's very apt to finish off on. Shows a modern cave diver. This particular guy is moving through the cave, and he sees the spirit of Martel standing, encouraging him there. And to Martel, this cave diver would seem like an astronaut or a man from outer space with this plastic helmet, goggles, 3 or 4 electric lights on his head, mysterious cylinders on his back, and this strange device, which of course is a motorized mini underwater sledge for towing the caver through the big passages that are in Padraig. And I'm finishing off with this quotation from one of a lecture that Martel gave in 1889 at the International Universal Exposition, talking about the Karst of Languedoc. No man has gone before us in these depths. No one knows where we go nor what we see. Nothing so strangely beautiful was ever presented to us, and spontaneously we ask each other the same question: are we not dreaming? So, thank you very much. Hope I haven't bored you completely rigid. I've gone over time probably, but there we are. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Richard. I found that really fascinating. I think it was the imagery for me. Selected really good pictures that really kind of showed me that how adventurous he must have been. Like, I can't imagine myself being brave enough to abseil down Padraig with relying on the men above to be holding me with ropes. And yeah, definitely a brave man.
Oh, you're some boy, all right. There's no doubt about it.
And before I give people the opportunity to ask some questions, if they have any, pop them in the chat. But I have one myself, and it is just about do you think he had, was there a sort of human impact to the work that he was doing and the places that he visited? Would he have provided some kind of temporary employment to young men in the area, and that maybe have been why he was invited to the so many caves that he visited, the 100 caves that he.
Yeah, he was probably the most exciting thing that had happened in a lot of these remote French rural areas, the most unusual and dramatic thing that had probably happened in generations. This guy suddenly arriving from Paris with all these mysterious boxes and this piece of canvas and some sticks, and the next thing he has a boat sitting in the field ready to go down this hole in the ground that these people have been told for generations not to go anywhere near because it was full of devils and demons and what have you. And he would have had much the same effect on people in Fermanagh, let's not forget either, because we weren't any necessarily much more sophisticated in those times either. And so yeah, it would have been a phenomenon really coming into the area. And he certainly inspired people in many countries to become interested in not just in caves but in other aspects of the environment as well. So yeah, it left a big legacy behind him.
Just check the chat here for any questions. We have one from Peter.
I'm losing you a wee bit in terms of volume there.
All right.
Yes.
There's just a wee question in the chat. This is maybe one actually more for Michelle about will Mac be running events for the International Year of Caves and Karst in next year, 2022, as it's been extended? Oh, you're on mute there, Michelle, sorry.
Yeah. And thanks for the question, Peter. I haven't received anything yet from International Caves and Karst to say that it's been extended, but if it has been extended, that's fantastic. We are planning in January and February to do other talks online over the winter period. And then going into the summer period, we'll probably be doing some more talks, outdoor talks. Just due to COVID, we've kind of had a change, understandably, the way we've run a lot of the talks. We have some beautiful video footage from back in 1976 from a cave trip in Fermanagh, which I'm crazy to show in the visitor centre, and got permission to do so, but we have to wait until COVID kind of calms down before we do anything like that. All our events are advertised on the website as well, so if you keep an eye on that, you'll see them.
I'm sure we'll be popping them up on Facebook as well, Michelle, if they get advertised. Back to the questions. There's one. It was just an extension of what Peter was asking. He's asked, why didn't Martel explore caves in County Clare?
A lot of the cave entrances in Clare, there are some fantastic caves in Clare, but a lot of the cave entrances aren't as big and obvious as some of the Fermanagh ones or other parts of Ireland. And of course, in that time, the Burren wouldn't have been well known or explored, certainly up in the High Burren. And so the caves probably weren't as obvious. Some of them certainly, like Alley River Cave in Clare, there's a rising, the river comes out of an entrance, but the entrance is quite low and not that inviting for a guy who's on his own to with no backup and no help. So that might have been an aspect of it as well. But I suspect his main intention caving wise was in Fermanagh, because it's almost certain that he'd been specifically invited by the Earl of Enniskillen to come to Fermanagh. So it could be that we don't know, but it could be that he'd had most of his bulk caving equipment shipped to Florence Court to wait on him there. He obviously wasn't going to take it around with him on his tour. So I suspect that's, there's a few reasons why.
Thank you, Richard. I've seen Colin was typing away there. You feel free to unmute yourself, Colin, if you want to ask Richard directly.
Oh, no problem. I was just actually putting in a thank you for the talk. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm conscious I did go over time, but hopefully
the longer the better.
Great, thank you. Nice of you to say so.
I think that's all questions, Richard.
I have a question, Richard. Just in relation to Martel, with all the travelling he did he speak many languages then? Like, to go travelling on his own, he must have been confident enough in a few languages to make his way around different countries.
He must have been. I honestly can't answer that question. I would guess he must have done, yes. And he must have had a reasonable command of English to venture over to Ireland and England on his own and travel around as extensively as he did. And of course, living in northern France, he probably would have been able to make himself known to in German and all the neighbouring countries like that. So yeah, must have had.
That's cool.
Okay.
No more questions. Lots of thanks though, Richard. People have found your talk very interesting, as have I. So I'll just pass back to Michelle to.
Just on behalf of everybody, Richard, really want to say thanks. As usual, you're very entertaining to listen to, and the amount of knowledge that you have in the area is unbelievable. And just to let everybody know that we will be sharing the taping recording of this to everybody in the next day or two. You'll receive it through email. And thanks very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's always good to have an opportunity to meet people again socially on these COVID days, even if it is online, and but also good to be able to bring a bit more information about one of my heroes to a wider audience. So thank you again, and sorry, as I say, for going over time, but
no, it was worth it. It was definitely worth it. I really enjoyed that.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody, and keep safe, and have a good Christmas, I suppose. Cheers.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.
Okay. Good night now.